Her practice started with Sakita Santarelli and John Kabat-Zinn. Is that correct? And followed with many other meditation teachers, and she eventually became a certified MBSR instructor and a mindful leadership teacher. Janice has served on the advisory board for the University of Massachusetts Medical School's Center for Mindfulness since 2004, and has held the Director of Leadership Education at the center, where, together with Saki Santarelli, she co-developed and co-taught the first Mindful Leadership Retreat in 2006. Today, she will speak to us all on finding the space to lead. Please join me in welcoming Janice Martirano.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And I want to add my thanks to the three wonderful organizations that have brought this gathering together, Mindful.org, the Center for Mindfulness, and Omega. And I want to thank each of you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you about mindful leadership in this bigger question we have about creating a mindful society. Already we've begun to see and hear and exchange with one another in individual conversations and as groups, the many ways in which mindfulness can have a transformative effect on the individual and maybe have a ripple effect on those around them. And the Institute's engaged in that same fundamental work of individual transformation, but it is also keenly interested in that ripple effect. So the Institute focuses its retreats and courses and workshops on those in our society who are already in positions of influence, whether that's in a for-profit corporation, a nonprofit organization, the government, or an academic institution. These women and men, for better or worse, already have an enormous ripple effect every day on those around them and on the community. So the work of the Institute is to offer mindfulness training in the context of developing leadership excellence. We're really exploring whether working with leaders might not only hold the possibility that they might transform themselves, but that they might also transform the work environment in which they lead and the communities in which the organizations reside. And this work definitely began with a leap of faith. Thanks to John, I was introduced to mindfulness, and thanks to Saki, I had an ongoing practice and I was learning to teach the foundations of mindfulness. I was beginning to see, as each year passed, the effect that mindfulness practice was having on my own leadership. But, like Richie, and I didn't know you were going to use this line, Richie, I too was a closet meditator. This is a coming out. You didn't know that. I wasn't at all sure that my colleagues would understand mindfulness or what mindfulness was about. And I was very sure that there would be a fairly large number of them that wouldn't at all think it was a good idea for one of their senior legal counsel to become one of those laid-back, new agey, hippie meditation types. But there also came a time when I could see so many places around me where I wondered if choices would be different, if behaviors might be altered, and if the burden might be lessened with a mindfulness practice, that it became no longer an option to not try. So I began through sort of the organizational development, executive development people at General Mills. And I had a whole presentation planned and went and sat with them and took them through this wonderful thing that I discovered and why I thought it would support the development of leadership excellence. And they listened very intently and very patiently and said no. And said, but you know, you could take it down the hall to the medical because they'll probably be interested in it. But I knew a lot from my 20 years of leading in organizations, and I knew that taking this in through medical would be a mistake if what we were interested in was the ripple effect. So instead, I started one by one to speak with some colleagues, people that I literally knew, worked with for many years, who are in leadership roles, and I tried to gather together a very cross-functional group, choosing someone I knew from finance, from R&D, from marketing, all different ways. And at one point got a critical mass together large enough that Saki and I took that leap. So with 13 officers and directors, all from General Mills, we went off to a little bed and breakfast in northern Minnesota and held the first 4.5-day mindful leadership retreat. That was nearly 6 years ago. Today, several hundred influencers from more than 50 organizations from around the world have participated in this exploration of mindful leadership through curricula specifically developed to support the development of leadership excellence. During those years, first at the Center for Mindfulness and now at the Institute for Mindful Leadership, we've learned and continue to learn that the doorway to influencers and potential influencers in our society requires a thoughtful approach and an ongoing commitment to the journey. And that journey begins with what, if anything, does mindfulness have to do with the development and embodiment of leadership excellence? One of my favorite quotes from one of the greatest leaders of our time, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, a powerful reminder not only of the need for leadership in every aspect of our society, these opportunities that are all around us, but it also recognizes that leadership excellence itself comes from deep within, this courageous act of looking within and being willing to be our full and true selves. And it recognizes as well that leadership is a capacity, not a given. It needs to be cultivated and developed. And her statement doesn't diminish the need for academic training, mentoring, and experiences that most influencers possess. Those are necessary building blocks. But mindfulness training does not substitute for these. It has become increasingly evident, certainly in the 20 years that I have been in a leadership role, that there is more that is required than those foundations and those building blocks. It requires that leaders bring all of their capabilities to the present moment, including this innate capability to be mindful. And perhaps we should take just a moment to take a look at why more is needed today from our leaders. The increasing complexity of today can be seen in these few sample bullets, and there are many more. We live now in a global marketplace, and we're just beginning to learn what that means. As leaders, we still haven't figured it out, whether we're leaders in corporations, in the government, nonprofit, anywhere in the world, we haven't quite figured out all the implications of being in a global marketplace. We are standing at the precipice of environmental crises in many aspects of our world. The health concerns that we face today are very real, and in the last 7 years, much of my work of the public responsibility has been with childhood obesity. And if you want to see an example of we must and can do better, you look at the numbers where we look at children around the world who are either malnourished or so poorly nourished that they are dealing with obesity at ages of 3. And we look at projections that talk about the first generation of children who may predecease their parents. We must do better here. And of course, time is of the essence. We can't wait for these solutions anymore, and I have a very strong belief based on my experience of dealing with leaders in all sectors of our society that some of today's leaders and influencers are an under-leveraged resource. Most of them are an under-leveraged resource. They know how to get things done. They often have access to resources, but they don't get to find the win-win-win solutions, the ones that could be good for organizations, good for societies, good for the individuals they work with, because they're so often caught up in the swirl of the urgent and in this complexity of unknowns that they don't pause to address what's important, to be able to bring all of who they are to those moments. It's been my experience that there are an abundance of people in leadership roles today who have bright minds, warm hearts, but these complexities limit their ability to positively impact their work environment and their community, to send out the most positive ripple effect, to start to create this more mindful society. They need more of who they are. They need to develop more of these capabilities of the mind that support leadership excellence. So how can this mindfulness training directly impact the development of these characteristics? If right now we were collectively to make a list of the characteristics you want your leaders to possess, or that you want to possess as a leader and influencer in your society, you might come up with a list that looks a little bit like this. We want our leaders to have the ability to bring non-judgmental attention. We want them to be able to be trained, to pay attention, to notice when their own judgments and expectations might be getting in the way of seeing clearly. Connections, trust, respect. The number one reason that people leave their job is not because of underpay or overwork, it's because of their manager. They leave their work because of the ripple effect of managers who don't make these connections, who don't have either the time or the capability or the understanding to show the kind of trust and respect. So that ripple effect can make a work environment either feel nurturing or hostile. Greater productivity, some of the work of mindfulness is to debunk the idea of multitasking. There's no room for waste. Like that one. In fact, there's no room for waste in that global marketplace, that global economy, and there's no room for waste when we're standing at the precipice of so many significant issues. A year or so ago, the Wall Street Journal reported on the productivity loss from multitasking, and of course, as everyone in this room understands, it was significant. But my favorite line from that article was, multitasking used to be called not paying attention. Simple. And for those of you as old as I am, you might remember those days sitting in a classroom when the teacher would yell, pay attention, you can't do more than one thing at a time. Creating space for new ideas, simply, we need groundbreaking changes. Little things aren't going to do it. We need the big ideas. We need people to have this space and to hold the space for their teams to create those big ideas. These characteristics translate into clarity, compassion, focus, and creativity. And although there are undoubtedly a few others, these characteristics are the four cornerstones of leadership excellence, critical to today's leadership, in my experience. We need leaders to have clarity, not what used to be, not what they'd like it to be, not what they'd hope for it to be. They need to be able to see what's here. And it's very different from anything they'd been trained in before. And it's going to be different next month from this month. We need leaders trained to see with clarity. We do desperately need that creativity. There are great opportunities in a global marketplace. There are great opportunities here for us to make very big step change differences. The opportunities are limitless, but we need that space for creativity. We need our leaders to be able to focus. Often when I'm working with leaders, one of the things that they notice and they're troubled by is they have a growing inability to stay attentive. Even when they need to focus on something from beginning to end, they can't do it. One of the ways in which we bring mindfulness to leaders who are curious and haven't yet stepped in is with some examples. And one of the things we say, and this may resonate with some of you in this room, it certainly is true for me. You could be sitting right across the desk from someone who's come to speak with you. Or you could be sitting in a conference table or having every intention to listen to the speaker, and at some point, or listen to the person sitting right across the desk from you, and at some point you realize you haven't heard the last 5 sentences that person is saying. You're looking right at them, and they're looking right at you, and it hasn't been all that long, and the mind lost the last 5 sentences. So when we need to stay attentive, when we need to stay connected and focused, and we're not able to, not only does that affect productivity, but that affects our capacity to go deeper and deeper into a matter and an issue that needs a deeper look. And, of course, we need compassion. Not only for others, but one of the biggest hurdles I've found for leaders is self-compassion. And beginning there is often one of the biggest steps that has to be made. And then the compassion for others and the community, and it is these connections that will guide the best decisions going forward. So this journey to leadership excellence, to developing these qualities, begins with stopping, with taking what we've come to use in our teachings as a purposeful pause, not only on the cushions, but at times all throughout the day. Whether that's a few breaths at your desk, every time you come back to your desk to sit down, you simply take a few breaths. Or you feel your feet on the floor. Or you might designate a meditation hallway. Many of our leaders do this. It's an area right near the place where you work, which then becomes your trigger. Every time you walk through that hallway, you practice. You feel your feet on the floor, you feel your breath in your body, whatever it is for you. But that's your trigger to be here all throughout the day. Because it's in those moments, those abilities to step out of the swirl, to step out of the autopilot, that we have that ability to have some of these better chances at clarity, creativity, focus, and compassion. But of course, even if we all in this room understand that this mental training would be great, that leaders would certainly benefit from it, that we might have greater leadership excellence, we haven't yet reached the hurdle of, well, would they be interested? How do we reach the segment of our society who's not struggling with a health concern and not really interested in stress reduction? In fact, if I go to a stress reduction class, many leaders have shared with me, candidly, that would mean that I can't handle my job. And in fact, stress gives me an edge. I don't want to lose my stress. So that's not going to be a hook. And in fact, how do we effectively communicate that this training of the mind is about bringing all of our capabilities to this moment? That in fact it's necessary to be able to bring this capacity to each moment in order for us to lead with excellence. And essentially, would they buy Secretary Albright's quote that the capacity for leadership is deep within us? That's very different from most of the training of leadership that we have in our society today. And after nearly 15 years as an officer of a Fortune 200 company, known for its development of leadership, and they do a tremendously great job of training their leaders in a particular way, I certainly wondered if it'd be possible to get leaders to give it a try. And I knew at a minimum there were some things I'd have to do to begin the conversation. So to start with, making the connection between leadership and mindfulness, I had to begin with what it isn't. So when I began to speak with leaders about what mindfulness is, my very first slide was not the definition of what mindfulness is, but what it wasn't. So it isn't a religion. I wouldn't be asking anyone to chant. We'd be burning no incense. No one would have to wear a long robe or shave their head. And we began with that, and a particular interest in that, although part of that isn't just, a large part of it isn't, because anything that has a religious connotation would be dead at the doorstep. Because corporations today simply can't. They can't bring any religion into the workplace. Can't bring any theology into the workplace. Just can't happen. Can't favor one over another. And in fact, what this is, which would be my next slide, is mind training. It's training the mind in ways in which, in particular ways, to support those four cornerstones of leadership excellence. And then another part of my conversation with leaders is always about the fact that it's hard work. That when we go off on retreat, there won't be spas. We're not playing golf. All the ways in which leaders often go off on retreat, those will not be there. The second part, and I've already told you a little bit about it, but it was very important to find that daring first group of pioneers. Those folks who were courageous enough to say yes to this newfangled thing, who were willing to give it a try. And why that was so important was what happened when they returned. So now this tiny little group of people came back to General Mills, and what happened then was the viral spread of mindfulness. They began to speak with other leaders, and there's nothing more powerful than the viral spread. So leaders telling leaders, and then leaders, and this is something I personally was counting on and knew to be true from other work that I'd done with these particular leaders, is that they would be phenomenal allies in telling me what else they needed, what else would support the journey. And in fact, they were great at that as well, as that residential retreat then became a 7-week course, a non-residential retreat, workshops on communication, strategic development and strategic input and innovation. And in 2008, the retreats themselves were opened to leaders from around the world. But even though mindful leadership was beginning to spread, I also knew that there was going to be a need for something else. It wasn't going to be enough for organizations to broadly offer this training without some research. And it had to be research in their language. So, I promise that I will tell you that I have nothing like Richie's research to show you, but what I have to show you is the kind of research that is mindful leadership, not mindful leadership, but leadership relevant research. So let's just take a look, and I'm just going to show you just a couple of samples. This first piece was a before and after piece of research on the 7-week course. The results that I'm going to show you are from 142 respondents and from 7 classes that I've taught over the years on this. And this is done with a rating of 6 levels, from almost always to almost never, and 6 gradations. And they were shown statements and asked to rate this. How true is this for them? So the very first question I'll show you here is, I'm able to be fully attentive in meetings, conference calls, and presentations. If you run an organization, you care about this number. I want to know how attentive folks in my organization, particularly my leadership, but all of my folks, are. And in that top 2 box, which I learned from my marketing folks is the important part of any kind of this kind of research. So the top 2 boxes are almost always, very frequently. Almost always, very frequently, I'm able to pay attention in meetings, conference calls, and presentations. 31% before, 7 weeks later, 75%. And the interesting piece on this question is that people know that they're not able to be fully attentive. A couple more questions from this piece of research. I notice I'm distracted by thoughts about work when at home or home when at work. This is probably true for, I'm going to guess, everybody in the room, certainly true for me. But here the piece is, I'm distracted by thoughts about work when at home. So it's not that I see that the thoughts come up, but it pulls me away from being fully there, from being fully there at home, from being fully there at work. I'm not fully anywhere. I'm partially all kinds of places, but I'm not fully anywhere. Before, 54%, almost always or very frequently. So again, those top 2 levels. Almost always, very frequently, more than half the population, 17% later. That doesn't mean those thoughts didn't arise, but that means that they weren't distracted by those thoughts. And the last one on this piece of research, I take time each day to optimize my personal productivity. If I'm running an organization, this is a scary number, that almost always and very frequently is just 2%. That the leadership of my organization spends almost 0 time optimizing their personal productivity, looking at where they add the most value, the greatest value, these highly trained, highly skilled leaders. 2%. And afterwards, 42% in that almost always, very frequently. One other piece of research, and I'll just share one slide on this, was done over time. So now it looked back on people who'd taken either the 7-week mindful leadership or been part of the retreats, and asked, some had been trained 6 months earlier, some 2.5 years earlier, and we asked them to speak or to respond to how much change they saw, if any, negative change, no change, some change, great positive change, as a result of the practices that they had then taken into their lives. And the high numbers here, 89, 80, 93%. And what we're looking at here is enhanced listening to themselves and to others, making better decisions with greater clarity, time to reflect, holding this space for discovery, for innovation. Some are great positive change. And what's important to know about this slide is these are already highly trained leaders. These are people who are already taking in positions of influence, who already have that ripple effect and are finding that mindfulness and mindful leadership practices has made a significant difference in their lives. And while these are certainly numbers that help speak to this ability to transform leadership, to transform organizations, potentially the communities, they're not at all the most interesting part of this story. And what is the most interesting part of the story to me are some of the people's stories themselves. And so I'd like to share a couple of those with you. We call them purposeful pause stories, or I call them purposeful pause stories. And the very first one. So I was guiding an extended session, which is a 2-hour session that's held in the Twin Cities for leaders from anywhere in the Twin Cities. And they're done every other month. We explore different things at them. And I was guiding this particular one, and one of the presidents of an organization shared that over the last 3 years since she'd begun her mindful leadership practices, one of the things that she has used on an ongoing basis was these purposeful pauses, these times where she would ask herself, what's called for now? And what she shared with all of us is that she found the most common answer was, shut up. That was the answer to herself. What's called for now? Shut up. And she went on to say that what that had been showing her was that in that not jumping to give direction to the team, not jumping to tell them how they should do it because she's done it before, or because she has an expedient way to do it, that first of all, the team felt empowered. Secondly, and probably as importantly, they often came up with better ideas. So by her not jumping in, she was holding space for something new to evolve. And she was also beginning to see her own limitations of jumping in and giving herself that space to not jump in with a quick answer, but to hold that space for something more or something different. Another story, a leader came back from retreat and went back to her project team, and she had been charged with a very important new project, which was critical to hit its numbers, to hit its timeline, to get it to the finish line, and it was going to be a very important part of that year's productivity for that organization. And she came back from retreat, and that week they had their update meeting, and they began their round table of checking in with all the sub-team leaders and what they were doing in finance and R&D and what all the different groups were doing. And she began to notice that she was feeling an uneasiness, something, not quite sure what. And she stopped the reporting about halfway through, and she described for the team mindful communication just in a very small part of it that she had experienced on retreat. And she offered them the small part of mindful communication that involves monologue. And she asked them each to take 2 minutes and respond to a very simple question. Is this a good idea? Is this project a good idea? That was the question. Now, they were months and months into this project. So at first everyone's like, she's lost her mind. But they did, and of course, as you might guess, they got all the way around the table, and the whole idea and the whole project was dead. And it was an enormous act of courage for that leader to do that. the happy news of it is they then use the rest of that time to fix it, to come up with something different, to come up with something that was actually ended up being far more groundbreaking. So we can all understand, and we obviously, from everyone's response, totally get the idea of productivity loss from multitasking. But there's something else that gets lost in multitasking, and I was just on a retreat 2 weeks ago with a wonderful group of leaders, and we were exploring silence, being in silence together. And we had just dropped into silence, and I happened to mention to the group as we were breaking from our meditation space that we're in the wonderful area of the country in Wisconsin where we were in the sort of a wooded area by a lake, and it was quite gorgeous, and it was a clear night, and I had been struck by the stars when I came to the meditation space that evening, and I happened to mention that at the end. And we all left the meditation space and went back to our rooms, had to leave the building, walk outside and back to the buildings where our rooms were. And the next day, at the end of our period of silence together that next evening, we dissolved the silence, and there was an executive there from a very large multinational, actually the president of a very large multinational company, and he shared this story, and I will do my best to remember exactly how he said it. He said, when I left last night, I left the building, and normally I'd be immediately turning on my BlackBerry and I'd be doing my BlackBerry, but since you told me that I couldn't do that, I didn't have it with me. And I remembered you saying something about the stars. And so I glanced up and I recognized that I hadn't seen the stars in 20 years. And I laid down on the grass, and I don't know how long I was there, and stared at the stars. And he said, as I came to the next morning, that thought stuck with me. And of course, what I also remembered was, and started to recognize, what else do I miss when every moment I'm doing this? So the myth of multitasking. And one more. This was a younger leader who wrote to me about this experience that she had. In leadership, one of our responsibilities is often that of mentoring. And most of the time, mentoring is over and above everything else that you do. And in this particular instance, this woman had volunteered to take on what was a very difficult employee, an employee who was having trouble making it. And she'd agreed to sort of do this intensive mentoring, and every other week they would meet. They'd agree on an assignment. This person would go back and work on the assignments, and they'd meet again. This particular morning was a very tough morning for the mentor, and in that she had an emergency early in the morning, and she was really tight on time, and she was very tempted to cancel that meeting with her mentee. But she felt like, now this person's really in trouble and struggling, so I'm going to keep this. And so she did. She kept the appointment, and the woman came in to meet with her. The mentee came in to meet with her. And she sat down, and the mentor said, well, let's talk about your assignments. And the mentee said, I didn't do them. And she said, in that moment, I could feel from my toes coming up through my entire body, the stories were just churning. I had a terrible morning. It was so busy. It's hard for me to put this in here, and I'm spending all this time with you, and I have all these other things, and you didn't do it? You know, she could feel it. But she could also feel something else, some little something. And so she had that purposeful pause, one of the ways we talk about feeling your feet on the floor, feeling that grounding for just a moment. So she didn't say what was on the tip of her tongue and what she would have been likely to say in other instances. And instead, she said, are you okay? And the woman dissolved, and it turned out was in the middle of a huge personal tragedy that had obviously been impacting her ability to even get through the day, let alone hold her job. So, another purposeful pause. And my last story is one that also came from just this last retreat from 2 weeks ago. And again, I'm going to do my best to share with you the words that were shared by the senior manager. Her name is Maria. So we were about 2 days into the retreat, and we'd just come back in from a walking meditation. And Maria shared with us what happened to her, what her experience was in this walking meditation. So here's her story. I always walk the same path when we practice walking meditation. I go out that door, I walk down the path toward the lake, and there's a little platform there. And I always go down to that platform, and that's where I practice my walking meditation. I feel so comfortable there, I feel comfortable with that view, and it's my truth of the lake. But this time, while I was doing my practicing, I was also noticing my colleagues from this retreat. I was noticing the other participants. So I saw Mike up on the grass, up on the hill by the lake, and I saw Anne out on the dock, and I saw Jim walking on the path between the trees. And I realized that they each had a different perspective of that lake, a different view of the lake, a different truth. And I wondered how well I consider this when I work with my team and when I work with others on projects and make decisions that I need to make. And many of us were deeply touched by her, what she called her aha moment. But she wasn't done. She went on to tell us that she also was wondering, when she was out there practicing, if I went further than the spot where I always walked, what might become of my truth? And she actually did it. So she moved from her spot, and she went over to walk along with Jim, who was walking on the path between the trees on the shore of the lake. And she shared with us that she could now see the lake between the trees, which was a very different perspective, and yet still a truth of the lake. This aha moment that Maria shared with us would come up many times during the retreat in different inquiries into the ways in which our reactivity can limit the bigger view, the wiser choice, that our truth as leaders is not as universal as we might believe it to be. It led to inquiries into whether, in fact, it's our responsibility as a leader to make decisions, to make judgments, or is it just to discern? This past Monday, Maria sent out to each of the participants on the retreat a gift, a slide, and I'd like to show you that slide. This is her Truth of the Lake. It's also all the different perspectives of the participants who were seeing that same lake. It's as well the compassion we shared at the end of our retreat together. She put that at the center. This became a reminder that many of the other leaders remarked upon in return emails of the experience and of the capacity for leadership excellence that lies deep within us. And as I mentioned, this work of mindful leadership also requires a commitment to continue the exploration. So there are annual alumni retreats where these mindful leaders get to come together again annually. We look at different things, and the things we look at and work with and explore in our mind training have been a variety of topics, from mindful communication to compassion in the workplace to clarity in the midst of chaos. There are courses and workshops for the teams because, like all good leaders, the leaders want to bring what touches them to the people that they touch. And so they ask for courses and workshops for their teams. There's a listserv now, a global listserv with hundreds of mindful leaders on it. And there are these extended sessions. And in the interest of time, I can't tell you about this gratitude leadership story, but maybe later. And the story continues. Private sector organizations are becoming a bit more interested in leadership and mental resiliency as they see the toll that takes on leading in the complexity of today. Nonprofit leaders, of course, are in as much need of this kind of support as for-profit. And so last April, I did a shortened version for the United Way executive directors in the Twin Cities. This next one, error reduction in oncology, this is a place where mindful leadership can come into as an intervention to reduce errors in oncology treatment. And this is a physician who heads a clinic who has asked that I come down and work on teaching 20 oncologists and radiologists mindful leadership in the workplace, in the places where they are making these decisions, where they are leading not only themselves but treatment teams, and looking at whether or not it will have an impact on reducing errors in oncology treatment. And then university training, training the next generation of leaders. Thank you.